Let's talk about the press, interacting with the public, and social media. I've had quite a bit of experience with this. I've had a little bit of training. I've gotten advice from various PR and marketing people over the years as well. So this represents sort of an amalgamation of all those various inputs. There are two things that apply to all of these different interactions. The first one is to know what you want to say. Know the message you're trying to get across. Have words associated with that message and be prepared to say those things. The second, and I actually think the more important thing, is know what you don't want to say. There are topics that you want to avoid or steer away from, and if you know those going in, that can help you do that. Now you might be thinking, isn't this a little bit like trying not to think about an elephant? It can be, but if you don't know these topics, you're going to stumble into them and have very little control over what comes tumbling out of your mouth. So now let's go through each of these interactions one by one, starting with a face-to-face interview with the press. This could be something that's purely audio, or it could be on camera, or it could be something that they are going to write down. Honestly, these days, because of the way that media works in the internet age, you should treat all three of these as if they are an on-camera interview for your outlet. So my tips here are, first of all, you don't have to fill the silence. It's a well-tread technique of a media person, of an interviewer, to ask you a question and then sit and wait for you to answer. Everyone has a natural inclination to want to fill the silence. So if they ask you a tough question that you don't want to answer, often they will just sit and wait and wait and wait until you get uncomfortable enough to say something, to give an answer, to make an excuse. This can also happen after you've already answered a question. If they feel like there might be a little bit more there, they might wait and pause for an extremely long time to see if you've got anything more to say, to see if you might let something slip. Personally, I actually find this one to be the more dangerous. Because you just answered a question, you're kind of already in talky-talky mode. So often a skilled interviewer can get a little bit more out of you just by waiting just a little bit longer than is comfortable. It's not your responsibility to fill the silence. They'll edit those blanks out anyway, so just wait them out if that's what you need to do. Though, that actually also brings me to my second piece of advice, which is you can answer whatever question you want. If they ask you a question you don't want to answer, or something that's tangentially related to the message that you want to get across, then answer that question. Don't answer the question that they asked. This is probably a lesson that I never fully internalized. Ray Musica was masterful at this. He would answer the questions that he wanted to answer rather than the questions he was being asked. Here's the secret. They're going to run that interview anyway. The internet demands content. And even if you don't answer a single one of their questions, even if you're reading off a teleprompter, content is content, and chances are they're going to run it anyway. Now, it can be annoying to the interviewer that you're doing this, and it does come across in the resulting interview that gets released. It looks like you're speaking to talking points because that's exactly what you're doing. But if you want to make really, really sure that you're never off topic, this is a really excellent way to do it. Something else I would recommend when you are doing these interviews on camera is you ask two questions up front. First of all, you ask whether or not they want you to repeat the question. And secondly, you ask if you're speaking to them, the person asking the questions, or if you're speaking into the camera. Different outlets have different desires for this. It's really highly dependent on what they're going to do with the final footage. If they're going to present it as an interview, a back and forth, they're going to want you to talk to the interviewer and not repeat the questions. If they're going to cut it in a different way, then they're going to want every answer answer to be fully self-encapsulated so they can present the answer alone without a bunch of surrounding context. The reason I think you should ask these two questions is twofold. First, sometimes they'll forget to tell you. Sometimes they don't even really know. And when you ask them, it forces them to think about it and give you the answer and make sure you're all aligned. But the second reason is that if this is a less experienced interviewer, the fact that you're asking them this question shows that you are a more experienced interviewee. And that can throw them onto their back foot and give you a little bit more control over the resulting interview, because you're showing that you know what's up, you know what's going on, and that they need to be a bit more cautious around you. I think for these in-person live interviews that it's important for you to understand what kind of storyteller you are, because each have some advantages and some pitfalls to look out for. If you are a story crafter, then have your messages ready. Have your talking points, stick to your talking points, say the things that you have crafted, say them well, say them effectively, just sort of barrel through whatever questions are being asked of you. Yeah, it's going to come across as kind of mechanical, but you aren't going to make any mistakes. It's going to be in your comfort zone. If you're a storyteller, well, then you're comfortable on camera. You're going to be comfortable with that back and forth and that ability that you have to twist and weave and build this tapestry of story in the moment. But that's also your biggest danger. You are also most likely to make something up on the spot that isn't even real about your game because it just feels right. It just feels like this is the moment to talk about zooming in on an apple to see an individual worm or something else that doesn't exist in your game at all. And meanwhile, your team back home is groaning in frustration because you've added yet another feature to their game. So be careful there. Peter Molyneux is somewhat infamous for doing this exact thing, for spinning compelling yarns on stage and features being created in the moment. If you're a story shaper like I am, then it's very important to understand the edges of where you want to go, what you're willing to talk about, what you're not willing to talk about, things that are out of bounds. It's somewhat similar to the danger of the storyteller, but because it's a story shaping experience, you're interacting with your interviewer quite a bit more, and you're filling in around the questions that they're asking and building a story around that question set. So if you have a good interviewer who is really interested in the topic, you can play off each other and build a more compelling story, something that fits what their audience is interested in, or at least what they're interested in. In some cases, the questions you're going to get are more about what they are interested in as opposed to potentially what their audience wants. But even so, you're going to get a more compelling story. If they are just mechanically asking you a series of questions, then your interview runs the risk of being quite terse and very factual because you don't have anything to play off and build upon. Story shaper is really dependent upon their audience to be part of the storytelling process. So if your audience isn't really there to interact with you, either because they're disinterested or for whatever other reason, it can make it very difficult for a story shaper to give a good interview. This is something that I've encountered when I've had certain kind of interviewers where you get they ask a yes or no question, you give a yes or no answer. There's no bi-directional communication to feed off of to build into something more. So that's where it's very important to potentially have a few things to drop into your interview to try to spur that interaction, or at least simulate that audience if you're not getting it from the interviewer. If you're at a convention or you're doing a press tour or it's a press event, there's one other thing to keep in mind when it comes to these in-person interviews, and that's the order that you do them in. As a story shaper, I don't want to do the most important outlets first. I want to have one or two less important outlets to sort of work the kinks out, figure out some of the different aspects of my story so that when I'm doing an interview with an important outlet, I've already smoothed out the rough edges. I suspect for the other kinds of storytellers, the order that is is most important is different. My guess is for a storyteller, you probably want to put that most important outlet first. You're fresh and excited and energetic, and you're going to probably have injected the least amount of weird stuff with that outlet. On the other hand, with a story crafter, I could see that you might want to have the most important outlet last in the day, because you've had the whole day to look for hooks upon which to attach your talking points. So your interview may come across more natural if you've had an opportunity to know where you might be able to inject each of the things you want to say. If there are any PR people listening, what I would say is listen to your talent when they tell you the order that they want, because they know how they work and they know what's going to work best for them. I tried for years and years to keep the PR people from putting the important people up front because that's where they thought it would be best. And I don't know that I was ever fully successful in preventing that. So unfortunately, I gave some less than amazing interviews to very important outlets because I hadn't yet crafted the story into a form that was ideal, because the handlers, the PR managers, the agency handling the press didn't listen to me when I said don't put them first. But to all the press people that might be listening, don't make any assumptions based upon where you show up in the day as to how important you are, because it's going to be very variable based upon the person that you're interviewing, and frankly based upon the people that are managing the interaction between you and the person that you're interviewing. For a written interview, I always try to get the questions ahead of time and basically do it entirely asynchronously. Get a list of questions, answer them, send them back as a whole. Don't do some sort of effectively one-on-one AMA, because there's no point in that. You gain nothing by having that interaction and you lose a lot. The biggest advantage of a written interview is that it gives you the time to craft your answers and to have them reviewed and to double check and to make sure you're not leaking anything you didn't mean to leak, and make sure that everything is buttoned up. If you do it live, you lose all that. If you're doing a written review, it costs you almost nothing to run it past someone else to double check your grammar and your spelling and the factual nature of your answers. So definitely do that. Okay, a little trade secret for written interviews. I would say in probably 80 to 90% of all of the written interviews that I've ever done, I've deleted at least one question from the question list that we were sent. I didn't tell them I was going to delete it, I just removed it from the list, answered the other questions, sent it back. Never once was there a request for clarification or a follow-up saying, hey, you didn't answer this question. So if you're doing a written interview, you've got the questions ahead of time and there's one or two questions in there that you don't want to answer, just delete them. You probably can't do that for a quarter of the questions, but if it's just one or two, yeah, just delete the question, answer the other ones, move on with your life. Moving on to the social media platforms, I'll include AMAs as part of social media. I think I have to start this section with a caveat. Your experience on social media can be highly dependent on who you are. As a cis white male, I think I get away with certain things that other people can't without getting massive amounts of blowback and harassment. Even on Dragon Age 2, I led that project. I was the primary face of that project. The level of harassment that some of the female team members got just puts the things that happened to me in a whole different category. So I think in this section, I'll tell you what I do and what I believe, but I think you have to apply your own experiences to what you feel able to, what you feel even safe doing on some of these platforms. My style in these cases is to be fast, to be truthful, to allow yourself to make mistakes, and then to correct from those mistakes. This isn't a style that's universally held by people who are quite successful on these platforms, but it's what I'm comfortable with. It allows me to be faster on the platform. If someone asks me a question on Twitter, I can respond to it quickly and give them an answer and keep the conversation moving. This increases the volume of communication that I can provide. On Anthem, I quite literally answered thousands of different questions about the game after we kind of opened the doors up wide at the EA Play the year before it launched. But yeah, it definitely means that I make mistakes. I say things that are wrong, I leak things, I accidentally cause a revenue recognition issue by announcing the date of a patch which goes across fiscal boundaries as a hypothetical. But I just feel that ultimately the relationship that you want with your player base is you want the conversation. And you need to have that conversation early, because if you can have that conversation going when things are good, when the relationship is positive, then you have something to build upon when you need to go to them because something isn't good, something's gone wrong. If you only talk to them when there's bad news, you don't have that relationship with them, and they're not going to cut you a lot of slack. So that's my advice with the social media platforms. Build the relationship, have the conversations, give them the information that you can, answer as many questions as you can, answer them as truthfully as possible. Don't hide things from them. And yep, it's going to cause some backlash, and yep, you're going to make some mistakes, but I just think the relationship that results is so much better. But this isn't a universally held belief, as I said. I'm just now realizing that this is ultimately the types of storytellers. Again, as a story shaper, for me, I want to have that ability to shape the story of the game in the public with an audience, basically building this aggregate audience member out of the interaction I have with the audience on social media. That explains a lot of the things that I prefer to do. This is why my volume is in the middle. People who want a perfectly crafted social media presence tend to have very low frequency tweeting. And that can work out really well because people are almost starving to listen for every single thing that they have to say. And everything they say is very well crafted and very well considered. On the other hand, the storytellers are weaving this narrative about their personal lives and their work lives and what's going on in the game, and building this much more elaborate interaction through a much higher volume of their Twitter presence. So for me, of course, I like something in the middle because as a story shaper, I need to have that back and forth. I need to understand what the people hearing my message are feeding back to me. So I need enough volume to allow for that dialogue to occur, but not so much volume that I'm literally drowning them out with my own voice. Does this mean that I run the risk of building a game, or at least building the messaging for a game, in an echo chamber built out of only the people who interact with me on Twitter? Yep. That would appear to be a risk that we are now identifying. On AMAs, this is kind of like Twitter, only accelerated. You also here have an expectation of answering questions. That said, if you have a large enough AMA, if there are enough people asking questions, you don't have to answer every question. You can just let them slide into obscurity if there are enough questions coming through. Now, if you're doing an AMA and there are only 10 people asking you questions, it's going to be pretty hard to ignore any of the questions because that question you're ignoring is going to be sitting there unanswered. I have to say that for me, the AMA is almost the platonic ideal of the interaction for the story shaper. Because it's happening so fast, there's so much interaction, you can almost feel the story that you're telling take shape during the AMA. And if you're you're skilled at this, you can, of course, guide and move where that story is headed. The perfect way to do an AMA is to have a team of, say, 5 people, all of whom are very well aligned to be answering questions simultaneously, because that ups the velocity of that storytelling and really lets you control the narrative even better than you can do alone. But that does require you to have a really well-aligned group of people. Finally, interacting with the public, specifically your fans. This is my favorite form of interaction. It's very one-on-one, very personal. Whether you're at a booth, at a comic book convention, or you are talking to people after a presentation at PAX, this is your opportunity to interact directly with your fans. Almost all of these interactions will be positive. People tend to be a lot more positive in person than they are online, so most of these interactions are pretty good. Still, know what you want to say, know what you don't want to say, because sometimes you're going to get a curveball question and you want to know already the things that you're not willing to confirm or the things that you're trying to steer into or away from. You need to have your guard up with your fans, I guess, because nothing is ever really truly private anymore. But honestly, my advice with the public is be as genuine as you're capable of being. Give them your attention. They mostly want to have a positive interaction. If you can give that to them, that's what they want. You don't need to guard yourself completely against your fans. One request for the fans who are listening: try to keep your interaction bounded in time. If you go and you're talking to someone from a game that you really love, try to make that interaction one that could easily end in 45 seconds to a minute. If the person you're interacting with is interested in a longer interaction, they'll probably give you some openings to continue it. But if not, it lets you have that interaction and then move on, because chances are if you're at a convention and you're interacting with someone from a game team, they're at a relatively low energy point. They've been doing press, or they've just come from a very important presentation, or they've been working the booth for 8 hours. So if at all possible, give them the out so that you can interact with them, talk to them briefly, and then move on. Some people from game teams will love to talk to you for a long time, but most are going to be looking to go sit down in a dark room and just let their day end. It's not that they don't want to talk to you, it's just that they don't want to talk to you for very long. So if you can, give them the opportunity to end the interaction after a relatively short period of time. If you start grilling them, then guess what? You just stopped being a fan and you started being a member of the press, at least from the perspective of how they are going to interact with you and treat you. So if you start asking too many questions, pushing too hard in different areas, then they're going to manage you like you were from a press outlet, and not a very important press outlet at that. So that's a good way to turn a positive interaction into one where you're going to feel them get more distant and more cold. So hopefully this was interesting. I would say that interacting with the press and the public can be quite difficult. It can be a lot harder than people who have never done it think it is. We all talk and it looks like it's just talking, but there are a lot of things to keep in mind in order to make sure that you're controlling your message for your game and giving it the best opportunity you can. A special thanks to my members. They help keep this channel up and running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link down below. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up so more people will see it. Share it with someone else who you think might find some use out of it. I will see you again soon. Thank you.